recite Yizkor on 4 occasions throughout the year: on Pesach, on Sukkot, on Shavuot, and on Yom Kippur. But only on one of those occasions, today on Shavuot, we read a book that is so profoundly defined by loss. Hemingway once wrote that all stories, if continued far enough, end in death, but the story of Ruth is a story that begins in death. As you may recall, in the opening verses of the book, we learn that a terrible famine has stricken the land of Israel. So Naomi and her husband Elimelech and their 2 sons Machlon and Chilion leave their town of Bethlehem, and they travel to the neighboring nation of Moab, where Machlon and Chilion take 2 Moabite wives, Ruth and Orpah. But in a tragic twist, by the 5th verse of the book, just at the very beginning of the book, Elimelech, Machlon, and Chilion have all died, leaving Naomi with just her 2 non-Jewish daughters-in-law, Orpah and Ruth. And Naomi tells them to go back to their families, and she's able to successfully convince Orpah to go back, but not Ruth. As Ruth famously says to her mother-in-law, El asher telchi elech, where you will go, I will go. Your people will be my people. Your God, my God. In the immediate wake of the death of her husband and her 2 sons, Naomi, understandably and justifiably, becomes an intensely bitter person. She says, Al tikrena li Naomi, krena li mar'ah. Don't call me Naomi, call me mar'ah, for God has made my life deeply bitter. And Naomi's use of the word mar'ah harkens back to an earlier use of that same word in the Tanakh. In Exodus 15, just after the Israelites successfully crossed the sea, they arrive at a place called Mar'ah. And the Torah tells us, V'lo yachlu lishtot mayim mi Mar'ah ki marim hem. And they couldn't drink the water at Mar'ah, for they were bitter. Now, the pshat reading of that verse, the plain or simple reading of that verse, would suggest that the word hem, they, refers to the waters of Marah. They couldn't drink from them because they, the waters, were bitter. But the other way to read that verse is that hem, they, refers not to the waters of Marah, but rather to the Israelites themselves. They couldn't drink the water because they, the people, were bitter. As a number of commentators point out, the bitterness of the Israelites, their lack of gratitude, and even their anger at God for taking them out of Egypt tainted their ability to taste the sweetness of the water. It was the bitterness of their souls that led to the bitterness of the water. And there's a profoundly important lesson in the story of the Israelites and the bitter waters at Marah. Life is always filled with moments of both bitterness and sweetness. That's the nature of life. And that's beyond our control. But what is in our control is whether we can taste the sweetness of the waters or not. Whether we live our lives with a disposition of bitterness or not. That power does lie in our hands. Some of you may have read the book, The Happiest Man on Earth, the powerful and deeply moving memoir by the Holocaust survivor Eddie Jaku, who died just 2 years ago. Eddie Jaku was beaten mercilessly by the Nazis on Kristallnacht, the very same night that he saw his family home in Leipzig, a home that had belonged to his family for over 200 years, burned to the ground before his eyes. He was a prisoner of both Buchenwald and Auschwitz, where his family was murdered, and he managed to escape from Auschwitz in 1945, and he lived by himself in the forest for months until he was found and rescued by American soldiers at the end of the war. And despite everything that he lived through, everything he experienced, Eddie Jaku thought of himself as the happiest man in the world. Not because the world or his circumstances made him happy, but rather because he actively chose to be happy. When he survived, he made a vow to himself that he would be happy until the end of his days. because he understood that happiness was the only path to true and complete healing after Auschwitz. As Eddie Jaku wrote in his book, "I have lived for a century and I know what it is to stare evil in the face. I have seen the very worst in mankind, the horrors of the death camps, the Nazi efforts to exterminate my life and the lives of all my people. But I now consider myself to be the happiest man on earth. Through all my years, I have learned this: life can be beautiful if you make it beautiful." My story is a sad one in parts, with great darkness and great sorrow. But it's a happy story in the end, because happiness is something we can choose. It's up to you. This past Thursday night, during our Tikkun Leil Shavuot, we heard a very similar lesson from Dr. Tal Ben-Shachar, who is one of the world's leading experts on the psychology of happiness and the creator and teacher of the most popular course in the history of Harvard University. As Dr. Ben-Shachar teaches, happiness and resilience, or what he calls anti-fragility, can be cultivated and increased if we actively choose to increase and cultivate them. As he wrote in his book called "Choose the Life You Want," happiness is determined by the choices that we make. What we choose to do and how we choose to think directly impact the way that we feel. Yes, Naomi is deeply embittered by the tragic loss of her husband and her 2 sons. Who wouldn't be? But the key to this story is that she doesn't choose to remain embittered. Instead, she chooses to help Ruth build a new life. She connects Ruth with her second husband, Boaz, and their child, Oved, becomes the grandfather of King David, who in turn becomes the ancestor of the Messiah, which is to say, at the end of days, the world will be redeemed because Naomi chose to be happy, because she chose sweetness and happiness over bitterness and grief. When we experience trauma and loss, of course we are embittered. But whether or not we remain embittered, that's up to us. When we remember our loved ones, we can choose to feel the painful sting of their loss, or we can choose to celebrate all of the countless ways in which they enriched our lives. When we tell their stories, when we teach their lessons, when we share their wisdom, will the waters of memory be bitter, or will they be sweet? As the book of Ruth teaches us, that choice lies in our hands. Our God and God of our ancestors, our grief lingers. Part of us is afraid to let go, afraid that we will forget. Give us the strength and the wisdom to share the stories of our loved ones with wonder and joy. Let us pay tribute to their days and their years, and may the memories of those who are no longer here always endure as a blessing within our midst. We begin the Yizkor service on page 516.